Good morning, and good morning to the top shelf. Hello. My name is Tim Shirk, live in Washington, D.C. It's my second time to be here in Eswatini, and the first time to bring my family, my wife Paige, and my daughter Jade in the back there. So wonderful. This is wonderful to bring them to a continent that I've been so connected to for the last 15 years. They mentioned my work in Rwanda and Malawi, and through those experiences and the work that I've done in our family office with Joe Ritchie, that's going to hopefully illuminate something that I want to talk about today. As you could tell, I'm not a pastor, so we're breaking the chain there. But don't worry, we'll get back to pastors shortly. I'm going to talk about something a little bit more technical, a little bit more tactical, really, today. I was given this topic to building your relational network. The main way I've learned anything I want to share with you today is by surrounding myself with people who are brighter than me and more creative than me. And that's been more useful than the degrees and the jobs, is that really putting myself around high-quality human capital. I'd like to take just a second to highlight one of those folks. You mentioned the office of Joe Ritchie. This is Joe. Joe is the chairman for President Kagame's advisory committee. He was very successful in business in the United States in multiple different functions. He was the one who introduced me to Joyce Banda and sent me down there. I've been working with him in his family office for 8 years. And he really saw the world differently. I think that was a big reason for his success. He didn't just take things as they were. He decided to always try to go back and look at things from a different perspective in order to make it through. And I got to travel with Joe for the last 8 years, working together on commercial investing for profit and also on our nonprofit and our generosity side. We have the same business brains that are on the commercial side. We're also using those same people are doing the generosity side, which in itself was a little bit of a distinction for our office. Joe passed away 1 year ago today. And so just little nod to Joe, my buddy. Thinking of you today, Joe. The topic I was given, pastors, nonprofit organizations, CSO ministries, even commercial C-suite teams have this challenge of how do they interact with their donors, have healthy accountability, build out a local team. This creates all kinds of issues, which many of you here are familiar with, whether you're a pastor of church or if you fit in any of these categories. Even the commercial guys, if you take on equity, if we come in and invest in your company on our commercial side, or you go into a strategic joint venture, you've got this issue now of your relationship with that new partner. Have you guys read Purpose Driven Life by Rick Warren? Anybody? Yeah? We work with Rick a lot. Joe was Rick's CFO, Chief Finder Officer. And what Rick meant with that was, I want you guys, you're going around the globe looking at people, because we believe human capital is the scarcest resource. He's like, when you find exceptional people, I want you to bring them back and so that I can figure out how we can work with them here at Saddleback or in the Peace Plan. And I love Rick's book, Purpose Driven Life, because if you've got it short on time or you're a little ADD, he does the spoiler alert right up front. Does anybody remember what the first line of Purpose Driven Life is? Anyone remember that? It's not about you. Right up front. If you don't read the rest of the book, you're good. Like, you've got the message right there. So for today, my message, I'm going to give the spoiler alert. It's all about relationships. So here's the problem. Partners, this was kind of spread in the context of like donor and donee situations where you're a missions group, a pastor, a nonprofit, because we're very active in these circles in the United States and Europe, and so we really straddle both sides of this discussion constantly in our office. That relationship can quickly turn stressful, uncertain, unfulfilling. It leads to tension, poor service delivery, miscommunication, mistrust, burnout, donor fatigue. You guys have probably all experienced that if you have this relationship in your life on some level. So what is the key problem in the relationship that causes this? It's money. Joking, no. I saw some of you nonprofit heads thinking like, yes, thank you, preach, yes. No, it's not money. The problem with the relationship is that there is little or no relationship. That's the problem. That's what creates these outcomes that are negative. So, what are we going to do about that? How did we get there? I think if you zoom back and you look at how this has unfolded over time, you see where we are, where we've been, how we got here, and our office's belief about where this is going. So when you go back to the first wave where people were going out of their communities into another community to try to help or engage or alleviate a pain point, you had that first wave of basic services, hospitals and schools. This was led by the faith sector. This is your first wave of missionary people. These were people moving from one community into another and actively delivering those services. In the 60s and 70s, the public sector entered the conversation. You had John F. Kennedy created USAID, the Peace Corps, ODM in the UK, which became DFID. Programmatic work started happening, the idea of programs, and the public sector became a player in this discussion. In the 1980s, projects and programs became connected to development outcomes. And the private sector started joining in, and churches started coming in their individual capacities, besides separate from denominations. 1990s put a face on these programs with the child sponsorship model that was very active on this continent and across the globe, and still is, to this day. 2000s, partners started getting disenfranchised, people were getting frustrated, those issues started rearing their head. They wanted people to work more together, collaboration. Let's get data-driven. We created the MDGs. Let's create a framework so that we can track and we can have monitoring and evaluation, better oversights, numbers, reports. 2010s, we entered into this phrase, impact investing. The project, your ministry, even your church, needs to have a business element, has to have a business model. It needs to be sustainable. So, here we are now, 2020 and beyond. Our office and a growing number of offices like ours, the United Nations, I live in Washington, D.C., I sit in on these multilateral discussions all the time, European, out of Brussels, those communities, large mega churches and those bridge associations. This is the conversation that's happening. It's the move to a relationship partnership. This is kind of a picture that we use in our office to describe the old model, where you have somebody here giving, there's money coming in, there's an entity, nonprofit, and it goes down to a beneficiary with services or products, then there's some kind of metric, it goes back to the nonprofit, they packetize it in some kind of a report, and it goes back down to the giver. This part, there's really next to no relationship here. And even this part is not a relationship, it's a glossy report. So we've been piloting Joe had been doing it for years, but together with he and I was started with him about 10 years ago, where you're engaging and looking for this key piece right here, the man or woman of peace. This is different than the entity nonprofit. This is a person, not a thing, not a registered org. Now you're co-collaborating. You're working with a humanoid, right? You are creating the play. You're bringing that to the beneficiary. There's a relationship happening here. And constantly, especially for us business guys, and we have a big venture capital component to our office, we're rapid prototyping, meaning you're constantly evaluating what's happening and you're constantly changing it as the needs and the realities of the situation arise. And that's okay, because you're doing it with your team. If you say you're going to do something in January, and you find out in June of that year that some big things have happened that make that not the wisest course of action or the most sustainable, you feel like you can't actually take advantage of that. You can't rapidly prototype the model because you said to the donors or your community or whatever that you were going to do this in January, and you don't feel the freedom to make those changes. But in this model, you are, because you're working actively with the person. We believe that this is a broken feedback loop and there's no co-problem solving. This relational model, the donor is joined in with the partner and have a different kind of skin in the game, while also getting the benefit of their gifts coming in alongside you, and it moves from programmatic to personal. Now, this is not, just the new fad that like 20 years from now or so, it's going to be the next line, I don't believe, on that graphic. In fact, this isn't new at all. This is 2,000 years old where we're pulling this from. Our office is not faith-based, but many of us in the office and the people we rely on do come from the great faith traditions. But this is actually from the book of Luke. And it's not just something that's like, well, this is good food for thought, but it's actually very relevant because this is going to become more and more important. What happens with this equation? Let's just take U.S. where I live alone. Conservative estimates by asset managers in our country say that $30 trillion are going to move from baby boomers, these are people my parents' age, to people my age over the next 20 years. We're about 5 years into it. That's through inheritance. That's not that I still have my job and I'm still gaining income in the US. But there's $30 trillion moving just there all of a sudden through inheritance to my generation and people 10 years younger than me. Just for perspective, because these numbers get kind of weird when they're that big. Eswatini's GDP per year is about $5 billion. That's the sum of all productivity here. So that means that's 6,000 years worth of productivity of the country transferring just in America alone over the next generation, right? So the implications, and what are they going to do with that? They still have their day jobs. They're still working at whatever they were working at and getting the paycheck for that, right? So this is a big conversation happening in America and in Europe as well, and other, developed countries. It's like, what's going to happen with that? And it's going to directly impact what happens with communities that are in partnership with people like that. So like I said, this is not new. This is something that we pulled from Luke. So let's take a look at Luke 10. Again, I'm not a pastor, but looking at Luke breaks into 3 sections, as I can tell. There's the principles, then there's the parable, then there's the practice. GL pastors like what I just did there? I got 3 points. They all start with the same letter. My dad, my grandpa, my great-grandpa were pastors. So let's start off, let's look at the parable quickly. So this is the one that everybody knows from Luke 10. Verse 25 through 37, it gets all the attention. It's the Good Samaritan story. Many organizations operating on this continent and other parts of the 1040 window and global south, this is a driving, impactful verse and section for how they operate. When I look at this and we look at this looks about the scope of who's your servant. Who is your neighbor? This is about who out there, when the 72 go out, who out there is your neighbor? And this is an act of specific mercy. These are situations where, a natural disaster or an intervention, someone's wounded right there in front of you, right? We look at this and say, this is a conversation about who is my neighbor, what's the scope of where the 72 are at, and also in specific impact moments. So we'll set that aside. But that's relevant in this discussion because that's a big part of it. The first part, the principles, what's what I want to focus on today. And this is kind of the backbone that has guided how we operate as an office and how we're taking other family offices, other donor groups, family foundations, large mega churches, and things that have large mission-driven thinking. And we've been walking through this discussion with them over the last 5 years. So verse 1, right out the bat, that says, go 2 by 2. Do not go alone. Now, that's a principle. I haven't read Pastor Craig's book, but I bet this is in there. When he says you want to be an exceptional leader and he's talking through the points, the idea, this thing that's in the ministry and in the missions construct of like putting the whole thing on your back and doing it by yourself, this just doesn't make sense. It's not what Jesus says to do. It's just, this principle is throughout the Bible, but it still happens all the time. People are putting all the work on their back and they're doing things. It's not only a path for burnout, but it also, when you have this, you have accountability, and you have authority. Unity with somebody gives authority. And if you really want to be bulletproof, add a third person, because a cord of three is not easily broken. So right out the bat, Jesus says, go out 2 by 2 and go into every city. Your friends and partners could be anywhere. Every city is in play. Don't base it on assumed geography. I've been here for about a week and change already in Eswatini, and I've heard some stories, people saying, I went to America, you're from America, I went to America and I tried this, that, and I said, and it just was defeating and hard, and it didn't come back with what I thought I was going to come back with from the trip. And I said, well, how'd you do it? What was your strategy? And I went to one place because I knew somebody, and then from there I went out and just tried to phone call, and I just showed up at different churches and talked. And I said, no one knows. You don't have a guide. You don't have someone there as your partner. You're going by yourself. Like, you need to, be with your 2 by 2 and go at it. Go at it with your guide. And they're like, what's wrong with just checking in your own backyard? I had a chance to be on the board of the Global Citizen Festival concert Mandela, just down the road from here 3 or 4 years ago. We had Trevor Noah was our MC. We had Jay-Z and Beyonce performed. I don't know if any of you remember this. We raised $6 billion in pledges that night in the soccer stadium. That was mind-blowing. No one had ever done that to end extreme poverty. But you know what's really interesting about that? $1 billion of that 6 was from Africans. African families, African corporates, African governments. They were stepping up in a significant way. And I believe because when that community came and brought the best here, they brought the best of them back. And that exchange was beautiful. It wasn't really highlighted in that. Everyone just focused on the big number, the 6 billion, which was largely done by governments in the West. But there was families and corporates here on this continent that showed up in a huge, generous way. So when you go out in every city, don't assume that you know that the geography has to cross any great lengths. Don't bring your money belt. That's a hard one. It's not about money. Right there. Don't even start with the money. It's not about cash. Money is power. You coming in and think you're going to buy relationships, if it's from my perspective, if as a donor or from anyone coming, or if you're looking in your communities and thinking that it's all about money, it's not. Jesus tells us right up front, don't start with the money. Don't bring your bag or your sandals while you're at it. What's that? That's stuff. I call this supply side philanthropy. We have stuff. We have a supply of something. So we need you to take it. We need you to use it. This is not demand-driven. This is not asset-based. This is not how we would commercially do it. I have to actually look and find the demand signal for something in a community, and I have to meet that demand. I don't just say, I have a supply of money. Our IRS requires in the United States, if you have a foundation, you have to give 5% of it away every year. So what happens? They're just looking for transactions, right? That's not relationship. Verse 5, peace to this house. Coming in with that spirit of gratitude, that blessing. Say a prayer in advance. Jesus is very clear. He's just walking us through. If you're going into a new community, this is what you do. You don't do it alone. You go everywhere as possible. Do not start with your cash. Do not bring stuff. Say a blessing. Come in a spirit of gratitude when you enter that new community. And then the big one, what I think it all hangs on, is find the man or woman of peace. In our view, it all hangs on this, verse 6. Who is that? This person is Not necessarily the biggest name in the community. In fact, they rarely are. They are not even necessarily Christian, because when Jesus said this, he hadn't even gone to the cross. But they do have exceptional character. They do care more about their community than themselves. You heard you heard from Pastor Craig this morning. They have it. We don't go into any community without figuring out who this is. If we don't find them, I'll jump ahead for a second. If we don't find them, well, I didn't put the bullet in there, but in the next verse says, then you just dust it off and keep on moving. We're not going to even start, because that supplies that. If I say, I just got to do something in Eswatini because I just got to do something there. No. If we don't have a relationship with somebody here, we're not going to do anything, because that would be crazy. And Jesus is very clear about it. We dust our feet off and we'd move on. And this isn't just like, that's nice. I guess you can interpret this way. I guess that's how your office looks at this. It's like, check the last half of that first section of Luke 10. Jesus goes on a rant. If any of you recall, he's like, woe be to you all if you aren't hearing this. He's like, it'll be worse your life is going to be worse than in Sodom. He's like, then he pulls his disciples aside and he says, hey, extra for you. Like, I'm really serious about that, what I just said. You guys have the ears to hear. I'm very serious about that roadmap. Okay? It is right there in Luke 10, right? We don't have to get cute about it. So this applies the other direction too. When you all, as pastors, missionaries, CSO heads, NGO heads, civil servants, CEOs, are looking, who are you going to work with? You should be thinking about this too. Even if you're not going out of your community, but people from outside are coming in, you should be thinking about this with them. You don't want to rely on the perfect program that you described, the tear-jerking video, the business model that shows how this is going to be sustainable in X amount of years. You want to rely on a relationship with a person like that. That's sustainable. That's the kind of relationship that starts to ease all those things that are that create tension and problems in this relationship with a donor. You also want to make sure that you don't look at them as an ATM. And they need to not look at their partnership with you as a program they tell their friends about or they write reports about to their governments back home. That's not what this is about. We're not here to run programs. Jesus has said this is about relationship. We are bringing these people through. One part of why I'm here is because I'm looking for these men and women of peace here, just like the ones we found in Rwanda, in Malawi, in Guatemala, Kenya, and the places that we've worked where someone said, hey, you should go check that out. And we will fly and we will do the work and we will find and meet with these people and try to find these men and women of peace, because we know if we bet on that, if we bring tailwind to them, that's going to be the ROI leverage that we could never get any other way. And we've done this for a decade, and we continue to see that this is working. So we're bringing those types of families into Eswatini, and we're like, hey, we got to be able to put them in front of these men and women of peace in this country. I like how Rick used to say, when we work with Rick, he would say to pastors, it's not about your seating capacity, it's about your sending capacity. If you want to grow your church, send them out, right? He's so right. Like, this is applicable to y'all too. If you are the head of a pastor or you've got a congregation, like when you send those people out, what happens? They are making a relationship. They're serving the community. Now there's a new friendship that they built, and that person that's new wants to come on Sunday to see their new friend again, right? This principle of it being relationally driven is what drives, what I believe is going to drive the future way that this relationship functions. Now, how did we get into this situation? Well, there's a lot of that graphic sort of showed it, but the focus on data, ROI, environmental, social, and governance metrics, all of that took us away from what Jesus said, which is to make this about relationship with one another. And it took us to focusing on facts, figures, numbers, reports. I believe in the future, we're going to have to get back to the relationship piece. And this is not, this is not just because there's the 30 trillion and there's a lot of capital, but this next generation, even people younger than I, they don't want to just sit there and be grantors. Millennials, Gen Z, they want to be in the story. Especially this inheritance, it's like, they're like, that's grandpa's money, that's daddy's money. Like, what am I going to do? What's my story in this, right? So it's for them to think that it's going to be like, oh, we just write a report or we send a mailer and they're going to get it and say, oh, okay, this looks something like I want to participate in. That's not where this ball is headed, folks. This is going to be a much more hands-on game. And if people don't start activating the real relational dimension that Jesus lays out in Luke 10, then I think people are going to be constantly facing those stress points that are a challenge for anybody who's in one of those roles. So let's just finish with the practice. The very end of Luke 10, there's a little vignette. Jesus goes, this is factual now. Luke's just recounting something that he saw. This is just real life. So Luke goes and sees, Jesus goes into this, seems like a new relationship. He goes in the house of Martha and his sister Mary. And you all kind of familiar with this know, Martha's busy prepping things. She's doing stuff. I think of that as like the programs. She's focused on making sure the programs look right, that everything's right. Make sure that that everyone's in line, stuff's cleaned, like everything's ready, right? Mary's just sitting there being with Jesus. She's focused on the relationship with the guest, right? And Jesus makes it very clear in the last few verses of chapter 10 who had it right. So you have the principles in the first part, you have the parable, and then you have this practice, all of which are pointing to this idea that this has to be a relational thing. When someone's going out, this is to the 72, remember, when they are going out into a community that's not their own, that relationship, that dynamic of somebody from the outside coming into someone else's community, that has got to be a relationally driven experience. And again, just to show this graphic again of how we believe the future, this triangle on the right is the future structure. And there's a lot of bells and whistles that you can add to that. So how do you do Luke 10? How do you become a more relationally based leader? You got to invest in it. You have to invest in it. These things don't just happen on their own. Big companies invest a third of their budget, Coca-Cola, Woolworth, whoever. They'll invest 30+% of their entire revenue per year on building a relationship with their customer, with their, called marketing, right? 30%. It's serious investment by these companies. Think about it in a spiritual sense, in a nonprofit sense, in a missional sense. That's the kind of things that you see the corporate world doing. Don't do this alone. These are complex problems. Don't be prideful to think that we individually have what it takes. That's true that's true both ways. I don't come and think I can just come to this country and figure out how to add any value if I don't have a man of peace or a woman of peace. That would be ridiculous. Realize that the great gifts of people God has in your path are not their resources. This gives off an aroma. I'm just telling you. If you don't have your heart right on this and you're viewing somebody, I don't care if they're a neighbor or if there's somebody coming in from outside, and that posture's not right, and they're looking, it feels like an ATM situation and not a real relationship, people are very savvy to that smell. The scarcest resource is human capital, not money capital, not land, not ideas. On our commercial side, we will invest in a great team and a mediocre idea any day of the week before a great idea and a mediocre team. Warren Buffett, the generation's greatest investor, says this is his trick as well. So invest in your team coming around this. It's complex problems. If you're doing 2 by 2 or by 3, right there, that unity creates authority, and that trickles down onto your team. That's how you start to build that culture inside with your staff. Your partners will start to feel like partners, not partners in the way that we put in the end of year report. Here's what our partners did. I mean real partners, like in a commercial sense, like when you really are relying on the two, otherwise you guys are out of business at the end of the year, right? That's real, that kind of real partnership. You're co-creating a solution. This creates buy-in. Buy-in reduces all of those negative issues that I pointed out to the beginning. People have disposable income and they buy something. They don't like it after a time, they can just move on, right? But if they're working with it, for it, to see it, they're going to be dedicated to seeing the outcome happen with you because they are part of the creation solution. They are part of working on it with you. Transparency goes up because you have been working on this together. You're rapidly prototyping. They see what you see. They're coming up with solutions with you. Expectation gap will shrink. The feedback loop between two friends, when you talk to your friends regularly, it's not, things don't go unsaid for a while. It's not like 6 months later they find out, oh, well, we haven't built that. What? 6 months? No, I'm still not doing that. I'm still not doing that. You've increased that which does service delivery grows. You have more minds working on it. That rapid prototyping is happening more regularly. And as trust and progress grows, they introduce you to their friends. What do you do when you meet a great new friend and you're kind of clicking and it's working? You want to introduce them to your friends, right? Now all of a sudden you're not advocating for yourself. They are. Nobody wants to be in that situation trying to be their own advocate for what they're trying to accomplish. You want that partner doing that. So in conclusion, I truly believe this is where this ball is headed. That we need to move away from the old model and start focusing on the relationship. But what these guys said this morning is right in line with that. They said it in a different way, but those leaders that have it. And you might say, well, how do I become a man or woman of peace? Well, I think you just buy Craig's book, and I think it'll explain in there how to do that. But, from our perspective, we just know it when we see it, right? We do. As commercial guys, we walk in, I've been here for a week, I'm meeting people, I'm like, boom, whoa, boom, okay. You want to be developing yourself with your team, with your 2 or 3. So, you're giving off that spirit of, I'm about others, not myself. You ask around, people will say, they know you, you've served in your community, your reputation speaks for itself. You want to be that person. But you have to be intentional about it. It's not going to just happen with time. You must invest in it. You even have to spend money on it. You're thinking, well, I need to be raising money. No, you actually have to sometimes you spend money to travel, to go be with people. Your time and their gifts are more valuable than their cash. I promise you. So without this, we are all just running programs. Whether we're on the donor side or the operations side, we're running programs. God is here to give good gifts to his people, not to programs. And if there's no relationship with the people, what's there left for him to bless? What's there for him to bless? The greatest treasures of God are in his people. He says that repeatedly, and we see that in our everyday lives. So start looking at your partners, your congregations, your employees this way, and watch things go from transactional to transformational. Thank you.